Everyone turned and gave way to the black SUV that made its way to the parking lot behind the college as it stood there gleaming in the sun. Barron Trump, an alumnus of St. Michael High School, had brought this as a gift to Mr. Johnson, the school janitor, as a symbol of respect and gratitude to the man who had shaped his childhood and instilled hope in him even when no one believed in him. It was perfect for Mr. Johnson, who always walked long distances to school daily. Barron stood outside the car. He felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He could envision Mr. Johnson's face lighting up with joy, and he couldn't wait to see the look of disbelief when he revealed the gift to him. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and sent for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson quickly came when he heard of who was looking for him. He hadn't seen or heard from Barron in years and was excited to see him. The two men hugged each other and exchanged pleasantries. Then Barron moved to the main deal. He thanked Mr. Johnson for all his hard work and for taking care of him. After he was done with his little speech, he handed the keys to him. Mr. Johnson collected the car keys while looking confused. Just then, Barron pointed to the black car across from them and said, "I brought this gift to you as a token of gratitude." Mr. Johnson looked at Barron and looked over at the car. Barron suddenly heard a loud thud. He turned to look and saw Mr. Johnson lying unconscious on the ground. He had fainted from the shock of the news. Barron panicked. This was not the reaction he was expecting. Mr. Johnson had been a janitor at St. Michael's High School for almost 30 years. He was more than just a janitor. He was a shadow in the halls, a quiet but steady presence who saw generations of students come and go. Despite his position, he was known for his kindness, diligent work ethic, and always greeting every student with a smile. He had a small workshop where he always kept different equipment needed to fix things around the school, and a parent's car in case of a breakdown. Mr. Johnson was always by himself and buried in his work. One student, however, had always paid close attention and liked him, and that was Barron Trump. Unlike other students who would barely notice the school janitor sweeping or fixing pipes around, Barron tried to talk to him often. He grew up watching the man work long hours without stopping or complaining. Barron often visited him in his workshop until they became pretty close. He noticed that Barron loved to join different metals together to form a toy car, and it interested him. "You are just like me, huh? You love fixing things," he said to Barron one day. Barron was always fascinated by cars. He had almost 1,000 toy cars in his toy room. During recess, when other kids were busy running around and playing video games, he was usually in the workshop with Mr. Johnson gathering items and small pieces of metal for his next design of toy car. Mr. Johnson gathered some scrap steel and brought it to Barron, saying, "You can make something interesting from that. Just look at it differently." Barron was fascinated. He had never made anything from steel before, only scrap metal. He settled down to work, and before long he came up with a cyber truck car. Barron was excited, and Mr. Johnson was dumbfounded. He never knew the kid was so good at this. Since that day, he has made it his duty to always find material for Barron's next car project. The two soon became best friends, looking out for each other despite the long age difference, which made it more of a father and son concept than a friendship. Mr. Johnson loved the company of Barron and looked forward to seeing him every day at recess. This became the highlight of Barron's day. Making toy cars from scrap metals and talking to Mr. Johnson was everything he came to school for. Mr. Johnson had known Barron outside the four walls of the school. Many years ago, as a young man, he attended the same school as Barron's father, and they had their little moments. Mr. Johnson was a nerdy kid who liked to have his nose stuck up in his books, and his classmates often bullied him for it. Barron's dad was one of the very few people who always stood up for him, and sometimes, when he was not so busy with other things, he offered to join him and read in the library. They were seen reading different science and evolutionary books and heartily discussing them. Although they were not close friends, they had their moment of close interaction, and Mr. Johnson understood the significance it had in his life since he had not made any friends during his high school days. Mr. Johnson had a promising future but could not attend college because of financial setbacks. After their senior year, everyone left for college, but Johnson just moved from one odd job to another until he finally settled for working as the school janitor. He had not seen or heard from Barron's father all this while until one day when he spotted a familiar face dropping off his kid at school. He knew that face. "Yeah, that's Donald," he thought. "Wow, he grew up to be a fine young man, who would have thought?" Since then, he watched from a distance how Barron was often dropped off at school and picked up daily. When Barron took an interest in him and started coming close, he wanted to play it cool and keep his distance, having nothing to do with his classmate's child. But he could feel that Barron was a sweet boy like his father. He couldn't ignore him for so long and eventually gave in to interacting with him. Another reason he liked Barron was that he saw so many similarities between himself and the little boy. Growing up as a child, he also liked to fix things into shapes, such as toy cars, torch lights, disc sets, and whatever he could find. He wanted to go to college and study automobiles to become an aircraft engineer one day. He had high hopes and dreams, but could not fulfill any of them. So here he was with a young teenage boy like himself with similar dreams. It made him remember the boy he once was, and the fact that he couldn't fulfill his dreams. After his senior year, Barron decided to carve his path. As he grew older, his passion for mechanics also deepened. He enrolled in the Institute of Technology to study mechanical engineering and business management. Everyone was surprised by his choice. His father had wanted him to venture into real estate and politics, but Barron was beyond interested in that. He had a different vision for his future and showed unusual curiosity about it. When he got into college, he discovered how rigorous it was, but he was determined to thrive. Barron immersed himself in his studies, spending long nights in the study room learning about different metals and their capabilities. During the day, he was found at the lab, creating new metal layouts and testing automotive designs, constantly improving and innovating. During college, he was not limited to school knowledge alone, but interned at a top car manufacturing company, working in different departments, from design to production. He wasn't interested in just how cars were built. He wanted to revolutionize the industry. He wanted to come into the craft with a notable difference. His classmates respected him for his relentless work ethic. They didn't understand why he was interested in working so hard, but they supported him, updating him when any automobile company was interning. Barron loves what he does, and by the time he graduated, he knew exactly what he was going for. He had a clear goal: to build his own car company from the ground up, not work under a boss for a salary. He had a vision to create environmentally friendly luxury cars. He was ready to experiment with different designs as well. Starting a company wasn't as easy as he thought. There were many principles involved. Although Barron had access to wealth and high connections, he refused to simply buy his way into success. Moreover, he wanted his father to respect what he did, so he decided to start on his own. Instead of seeking massive investors right away, he opted to begin small. He assembled his team of young engineers, designers, and young strategists who shared his vision. Together, they rented a warehouse and worked tirelessly in it. They were working to create their first car design and launch it in an upcoming car exhibition that will host millions of people. The early days were brutal, but Barron was determined. He often encouraged his team members not to give up and work relentlessly until they achieved their goals. Barron poured money into research and development. He even took loans when necessary, but setbacks were bound to come. Their prototype was an electric sedan with an extended range. There was no car type like this in the country, and Barron and his team were the first to come up with this design. Everything was going on fine, but the car had a problem with battery efficiency. They were finding it difficult to add up the voltage that would be able to power the car efficiently. Barron was becoming skeptical of everything. He didn't just want to be an entrepreneur, he wanted to be good at what he did. He was not going to quit. He had come so far, and he doubled down. Mounting pressure on his team, they reworked the design, improved efficiency, and pushed until they crossed boundaries. He wasn't just building cars, he was crafting an identity, a brand that will stand for its uniqueness, sustainability, and luxury. The turning point came when Barron brought his first official model, the Velocity X. Not only was this car luxurious, it was also combined with an advanced AI detector and driving assistance technology with an extended battery range. The car virtually operated itself, to the doors opening and everything. It was self-sufficient, rivaling and surpassing the famous Tesla design in key performance metrics. After Barron had shown how his car worked in the exhibition, it was bidding for $700 billion. And look at how many buyers were up for it. They had to increase the price to beat it down to one buyer, making it sell out for $900 million. After the show, over 50 pre-orders were placed immediately for Velocity X, which surprised Barron considering how expensive the car was. People took notice and wanted to invest in his company. Others offered funding. Everything happened so fast, and saddening, the company that was struggling for years was on the verge of a big turnaround. They bought land, built their working garage, and opened their store in a 5-story building. Over the next decade, Barron's company could not be recognized. It became one of the biggest names in the industry. His focus on luxury electric car designs made the brand stand out in its uniqueness. By the time Barron was 30, he had achieved what he thought was impossible. He had built a high-selling car company that rivaled the biggest name in the world. After being positioned in a successful state, he decided to settle down and build a family. He met his wife Isabella during a business summit, and there was a spark between them. She was drawn to his vision, ambition, and relentless drive. Their relationship bloomed. They were both ambitious, and she helped him navigate his influence on the business world as an economist, offering insight and strategists that took the company further. After being together for 2 years, Barron proposed to Isabella when they went on a date at the beach. Their wedding followed immediately in a grand yet elegant setting. It was attended by business tycoons, world leaders, and close family members. After a year, Barron and Isabella welcomed their first child, Liam, who was later followed by their daughter, Sophia. Becoming a father was a new era for Barron, and it changed him in ways he never expected. While he had always been driven by his ambitions, he now had a higher and deeper purpose: to create a future for his children. By his mid-30s, Barron had become one of the most influential figures in the automotive industry. His company had expanded globally, opening factories in countries like Europe, Asia, and Africa, and introducing self-sufficient driving technology that was years ahead of the competition. No one was as good as Barron's Motors in the industry. However, despite his success, he never forgot one person who was the source of the fire that ignited the flames in his heart for automobiles. One day, during his press conference, he was asked how he had managed to become successful. He smiled and said, "My success did not begin today. It began in the far years of my childhood with a man believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself. A man who saw my future before I did. A man nobody recognizes but worked behind the shadows to make me who I am today." Everyone wondered if he spoke about his father, but no one had the boldness to ask, so they all assumed Barron had a supportive father who believed in him. After the conference, Barron decided to visit his high school and offer his gratitude to the man he spoke about. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden presence over the compound of St. Michael High School. Students milled about with laughter, and chattering filled the air as they made their way to their classes. This was the day Barron visited Mr. Johnson at his high school. As he thought of how best to offer his gratitude to the janitor, he remembered how he loved the SUV models when he was a child, and would always talk about how cool the car was. Barron would have preferred gifting him a car from his company, but he wanted to fulfill Mr. Johnson's long-time wish to own an SUV. Mr. Johnson had said that even though he owned one, he would still work as a janitor, which surprised Barron. Now, thinking back at it, he completely understood Mr. Johnson, knowing fully well that what you own does not define who you are. Barron went to a car store that morning and bought the latest SUV model in Mr. Johnson's favorite color, black. He then placed a ribbon on it, drove the car into the school premises, and set out to call him. Mr. Johnson came out quickly when he heard who needed to see him. He saw Barron standing under a shade close to his garage. At this point, he could hardly recognize him. Barron went over to him and hugged him tightly. They exchanged pleasantries and tried to catch up over some jokes. Afterward, Barron told him he had a gift for him. Mr. Johnson's face lit up. He wondered what Barron wanted to give him. Barron held his hand, and they moved slowly to the parking lot where Barron had packed the car earlier, and Barron handed him the keys. Mr. Johnson looked at him confused. Barron simply pointed to the black car standing pretty in the parking lot. Mr. Johnson looked at the car, and then at Barron. "You brought this to me?" he asked. Barron nodded and smiled. Just then he heard a thud on the ground, and when he turned, he saw Mr. Johnson lying unconscious on the ground. He panicked and raised an alarm. Students and teachers gathered around him, and the school nurse was sent for. After like an hour, they managed to revive him, and when he became conscious again, he began to cry. Everyone looked at Barron suspiciously and wondered why Mr. Johnson had fainted, and why he was now crying like a baby in front of them. Barron could tell what they were thinking from their expressions, and decided to give a little speech. He wanted this to be a little reunion between him and Mr. Johnson, but since people had gathered, he figured he needed to address the situation. "I came here today as an alumnus of this great school to give my one-time friend and mentor a car. I wanted to thank him for everything he had done for me. All those years he spent helping me find materials to build toy cars. I couldn't have become who I am today without you, and that is why I have come here today to offer my gratitude." Mr. Johnson approached him and said, "But Barron, this is too much. I can't accept this," he stuttered, shaking his head. "You can and you will," Barron answered. "By the way, who rejects an SUV?" he joked, and everyone laughed. "You were there for me when I needed someone, and I want to do the same by being here for you, because you deserve it," Barron continued. Tears welled up in Mr. Johnson's eyes again as he hugged Barron tightly, overwhelmed by this gesture. "I don't know what to say. This is incredible. I never expected anything like this." Barron smiled, feeling a warm impact spread through him. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you have greatly impacted my life, and I wanted to show how much you mean to me." Mr. Johnson wiped his eyes, struggling to find his voice. "You're a good kid, Barron. I always knew you were destined for great things, and you were too smart for your age, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." As the two of them stood there, they were consumed by many waves of emotions. Students were up with their phones, capturing the moments, but neither Barron nor Mr. Johnson cared. To them, this moment was not just about the SUV. Barron felt the weight of their years together, the laughter, the lessons, and Mr. Johnson's unwavering support. To him, it was a celebration of their friendship, a bond forged through shared dreams and hard work. "Let's take it for a ride," Barron suggested to ease the tension in the air and lighten the mood. "I'll show you how it works." With a hesitant smile, Mr. Johnson nodded and climbed into the SUV as everyone applauded them. Barron climbed into the driver's seat, turning the engine on as the car roared to life. This was the kind of sound he loved to hear. It was music to his ears, and he couldn't help but smile broadly. He looked over at Mr. Johnson, who was still tense and in shock, his hands gripping the car seats tightly. Barron understood and decided to give him some time to process things through. "Ready?" Barron asked excitedly. "Ready as I'll ever be," Mr. Johnson answered, his voice shaky but full of anticipation. As they drove through the school, Mr. Johnson finally chatted freely and happily. Barron felt a wave of fulfillment wash over him. For a brief moment, Mr. Johnson could not think of anything else, as all worries faded away, replaced by the joy of the journey and the bond they shared. Just then, an idea struck Barron. He wouldn't want Mr. Johnson to drive to a janitor's job in an SUV every morning. Before long, the ridicule from students would start to come in. At that moment, he decided to give him a job proposal, explaining his concerns. Mr. Johnson was also getting old and needed a more stable job. Luckily for him, after stating everything to Mr. Johnson, he agreed to work with Barron at the company as his business advisor. Barron wanted him to have a role that required less stress, and Mr. Johnson was more than willing to oblige. The next day, Barron woke up to his name popping everywhere on the headlines. Those students had posted what happened, and the news was spreading widely. Everyone commended Barron for remembering Mr. Johnson. Surprisingly, his company's sales went up because people who hadn't heard of them before wanted to make a purchase. Although Barron didn't know how to feel about being in the spotlight like this, he was happy it was good for his business and company name. Once again, Mr. Johnson had brought good luck into his life. He soon realized the man was a blessing in disguise. What do you think about Barron's appreciation gift to Mr. Johnson? Was it worth it? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this video was inspiring, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, click the links on your screen for more insightful videos. You can also tap the bell icon to get a notification when we post a new one. See you next time.